Chapter 4. The Waiwaxia Wisdom. Encouraged by Norm's unexpected philosophical breakthrough, Wee decided to share her own existential journey. "You know," she began, settling her spiky, scale-covered body more comfortably on the seafloor, "I used to think my problem was that I looked like a medieval weapon having an identity crisis. Spikes on top, scales on the bottom, no clear evolutionary relationships. I felt like a biological non sequitur." "You kind of are," Mary said, then quickly added, "but in a good way." "Exactly," Wee exclaimed. "That's what I realized. Maybe being a non sequitur is my superpower. Maybe the point isn't to fit neatly into some grand evolutionary plan. Maybe the point is to be so weird and wonderful that millions of years from now, when paleontologists find our fossils, they'll spend decades arguing about what we were and where we fit in the tree of life." "That does sound kind of immortal," Opie mused, "being a scientific mystery forever." "Right? I mean, sure, we might all be evolutionary dead ends, but we'll be the most interesting dead ends in the fossil record. Future scientists will write papers about us with titles like The Enigmatic Waiwaxia, Mollusk, Annelid, or something else entirely. And
Opabinia regalis. What the hell was this thing supposed to be?
"What the hell was this thing supposed to be" would be a great title for my autobiography, Opie said. "We should all write autobiographies," Halley suggested. "Future creatures need to know what we were thinking." "How would we write them?" Tribby asked practically. "We don't have hands, or writing implements, or language, or the concept of writing." "Details," Halley waved dismissively with a tentacle. "We'll figure it out." Canny, who had been quietly contemplating his own existential issues, finally spoke up. "I think my problem is simpler than all of yours. I'm going to be named after Canada."
Everyone stared at him.
"So?" Pike asked. "Canada doesn't exist yet. It won't exist for another 540 million years. And when it does exist, it's going to be known for being really cold and having a lot of trees and being very polite. Does that sound like me?" The group considered this. Canny was indeed not particularly cold, tree-covered, or polite. He was more of a aggressive marine arthropod with poor social skills kind of creature. "Maybe Canada will be different than you think," Mary suggested. "Maybe it will be full of aggressive marine arthropods with poor social skills." "That would be kind of cool," Canny admitted. "Like a whole country of me's." "Actually," Tribby said, "I just realized something. If we're all going to be named after places that don't exist yet, or after scientists who won't be born for hundreds of millions of years, doesn't that mean we're already connected to the future? We're part of a story that hasn't been written yet." "That's either beautiful or terrifying," Sid said. "Why not both?" Norm suggested.
Chapter 5. The Great Realization. As the therapy session continued, the creatures began to develop what could generously be called a philosophy, or what could more accurately be called a group rationalization for why their lives didn't seem to make sense. "I think," Opie announced, "that we're looking at this all wrong. We keep asking, what's our purpose? But what if the question should be, what's our impact?" "Explain," Wee encouraged. "Well, think about it. Even if we all go extinct, even if we're all evolutionary dead ends, we're still going to leave traces, fossils, evidence that we were here, that we tried different ways of being alive. And maybe those traces will inspire the creatures that come after us." "Inspire them to do what?" Mary asked. "I don't know. To be brave enough to try being weird? To experiment with having 5 eyes or spikes in random places or swimming shoelace bodies." Opie looked meaningfully at Pike, who tried to look dignified despite being an early chordate. "You know," Pike said slowly, "maybe that's not such a bad legacy. Being the creatures who proved that life could be creative, that it could try things that seemed impossible. Plus, Halley added, we're living during the Cambrian explosion. Do you realize how lucky we are? This is literally the most creative period in the history of life on Earth. Body plans are being invented left and right. New ways of seeing, moving, eating, being. We're part of the greatest experimental phase in biological history.
When you put it like that, Sid said, it does sound pretty special.
It is special, Tribby exclaimed, his existential gloom lifting. We're pioneers. We're the first creatures to really figure out how to be complex. Before us, everything was just single cells floating around being boring. We invented having bodies.
Reinvented having multiple body parts, Norm added, flexing his front appendages with renewed pride.
We invented having eyes,
Opie chimed in, all 5 of hers focusing on the group with enthusiasm.
We invented being really, really weird, Halley laughed, doing a little dance on her spiky legs. And we invented thinking about why we exist, Mary concluded. We might be the first creatures in the history of the universe to have existential crises. That's gotta count for something. The group paused, struck by this realization. We invented philosophy, Wee-Wee said quietly. We're the first creatures to ask why and what's the point and what does it all mean? That's actually huge, Canny said. Even if Canada turns out to be nothing like me, at least I can say I was part of the species that invented wondering about stuff.
Chapter 6. The Cambrian Conclusion. As the therapy session wound down, the creatures found themselves in a much better mood than when they'd started. They'd gone from existential despair to something approaching existential acceptance, with a healthy dose of cosmic pride thrown in. So, Wee-Wee said, looking around at the group, I think we can all agree that even though we don't know what our ultimate purpose is, we're still pretty amazing for being the first creatures complex enough to worry about it. Agreed, Norm said, and even if we are going to be replaced by dinosaurs, at least we'll always be able to say, we came first. Plus, Opie added, dinosaurs are going to be so mainstream. We're always going to be the cool, obscure creatures that only the really dedicated paleontologists appreciate. I can live with being a paleontologist's favorite, Halley said. That sounds like a good kind of immortality. Pike, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. You know, I've been thinking about what I said earlier about being the ancestor of all vertebrates. Even if that's true, it doesn't mean you guys aren't important. I mean, what's the point of being the ancestor of everything if there's no diversity? If there aren't weird, wonderful creatures like all of you to make life interesting? That's very generous of you, Pike, Mary said. I'm just saying, even if I do end up being the great times a billion grandfather of sharks and elephants and birds, they're going to need ecosystems to live in. They're going to need other creatures to interact with. And maybe some of those creatures will be descended from you guys. And maybe some will be completely new experiments that evolution tries out. Either way, you're part of the story. The story of what? Tribby asked.
Life, Pike said simply. The story of life, figuring out how to be more and more creative, more and more complex, more and more alive.
I like that story, Sid said. Even if my chapter is short, at least it's interesting. All our chapters are interesting, Norm declared. We're the Cambrian creatures. We're the ones who proved that life could be weird and wonderful and completely unexpected. We're the ones who showed that evolution could have a sense of humor. Speaking of humor, Canny said, does anyone else think it's funny that we're having this conversation at all? I mean, we're a bunch of ancient sea creatures having an existential crisis about being replaced by dinosaurs that won't exist for another 250 million years. The group considered this. It is pretty ridiculous, Opie admitted.
I love it, Halley said. If we're going to have an existential crisis, at least it's a really, really premature one. The first existential crisis in Earth's history, Wee added proudly. Another first for us! To being first, Norm declared, raising his front appendages in what would have been a toast if alcohol had been invented. To being weird, Opie added. To being wonderful, Halley chimed in. To being alive during the most creative period in the history of life, Pike contributed. To being so confusing that future scientists will spend their entire careers trying to figure out what we were, Mary laughed. To being the coolest fossils in the rock record, Sid declared. To being part of the greatest story ever told, Tribby announced. To being us, Canny concluded. And with that, the first therapy session in Earth's history came to an end. The creatures dispersed back to their various parts of the Cambrian seas, feeling significantly better about their place in the cosmic scheme of things.
Epilogue: The Fossil Record. 505 million years later, a paleontologist named Dr. Sarah Chen was hunched over a microscope in the Royal Ontario Museum, examining a particularly well-preserved specimen of Anomalocaris canadensis. She'd been studying Cambrian fossils for 15 years, and they never ceased to amaze her. "What were you thinking about?" she murmured to the fossil, as she often did when working late at night. What was it like to be alive back then, when everything was new and weird and wonderful? If she could have heard the answer, she might have been surprised to learn that Anomalocaris canadensis, let's call him Norm, had spent a considerable amount of time thinking about exactly the same thing she was, what it meant to be alive, what the point of existence was, and whether any of it really mattered in the grand scheme of things. But Norm had figured out something that Dr. Chen was still working on, that maybe the point wasn't to have all the answers. Maybe the point was just to be amazing enough that someone, somewhere, somewhen would look at the evidence of your existence and think, wow, life is incredible. And as Dr. Chen adjusted her microscope and marveled once again at the bizarre beauty of Cambrian life, Norm's ancient wish was fulfilled. He was still inspiring wonder, still proving that life could be creative and unexpected and gloriously, inexplicably weird. Not bad for a creature having an existential crisis. In a display case nearby, specimens of Opabinia, Hallucigenia, Wiwaxia, and the rest of the Burgess Shale gang sat in eternal testimony to the fact that life's greatest experiment wasn't in creating the biggest, or the strongest, or the most successful creatures. It was in proving that existence itself could be an art form. And that, perhaps, was purpose enough.